It gives me pleasure now to be welcoming onto the stage. I'm sure to be a doctor shortly. Aine Regan, who's played from the University College Dublin, who has played a really important role in coordinating on behalf of the FoodRisC consortium.
So, as Laura said, hopefully to be a PhD, I'm finishing off my PhD at the minute on the FoodRisC project, and I just wanted to present very briefly some insights from the FoodRisC project that we've looked at when we looked at the impact of conflicting food risk and benefit messages on consumer perceptions. So Goldberg and Sliwa idealised what a perfect food and nutrition information landscape might look like. And that was specific dietary guidance to the public would come from a respected authority only when there was solid scientific agreement on a given nutrition topic. Ancillary messages from other sources would augment that advice with consistent actionable behaviour. That does sound quite ideal, but the authors also acknowledge that that is actually both impractical and highly unlikely, because they know that the food and nutrition information landscape, it's highly chaotic. You have so many information channels and so many information sources where consumers can get and are exposed to many different messages on food and nutrition. And so it's no wonder really that there's increasing evidence to suggest that consumers are becoming increasingly confused and perceiving conflicting information. So what we wanted to know was, how do perceptions of conflict arise? And what we looked at in the FoodRisC project was one potential source of conflict, and that's the conflict that can arise when risk and benefit messages relate to the same food. So that's where a single behaviour, and we take the example of consuming oily fish, it's a typical example in this instance, a single behaviour for the consumer of eating oily fish, it can actually produce two or more distinct outcomes. So for example, you might have a beneficial outcome. Oily fish is a good source of omega-3s and it can lower your risk of heart disease. On the other hand, there is a risky outcome as well associated with this single behaviour of consuming oily fish, and that's that the risk that it can contain dioxins and PCBs, which may be harmful over a longer period of time. And this poses a serious communication channel or communication problem, because when you see that food risk and benefit messages can be communicated to the public, and they might infer that conflict exists, where those risk and benefit messages appear across different information channels. So on the one hand, you have communication that is promoting the benefits of consuming oily fish. On the other hand, you have a communication that's promoting the risks. So really, it's no surprise that consumers might actually feel quite confused and uncertain about the actual health consequences of engaging in that behaviour. So with the FoodRisC project, we looked at this idea of how do consumers react to these instances of risk and benefit messages. And we found from our very early research that we carried out in the project, qualitative interviews with 99 consumers across 5 European countries, we found that there was really this feeling of being bombarded with risk and benefit messages relating to diet and health, and they were being perceived as inconsistent or contradictory. And there was also worryingly evidence of a developing indifference to food and nutrition messages as a result, as well as feelings of frustration, confusion, anger and cynicism. And I think this quote sums it up quite nicely from one of the male participants in Ireland, of this idea of a back and forth between risk and benefit messages. I mean, coffee was good for you, and then it was bad for you, then it was good for you, then it was bad for you, and now I don't know and I don't care. You get fed up with so-called sort of scientist groups, consumer groups. So that really shows the indifference that's developing, and the anger as well, and the frustration and the exasperation towards this idea of mixed messages being communicated to the consumer. This again was backed up by further qualitative analysis that we carried out. We looked at the comments section of 2 online media articles which had reported on the health risks of eating red meat. And again, we found within some of these comments a lot of, again, frustration and anger at this perception of mixed messages being communicated to the public. So if we take the middle comment there, again, we can see this idea. I'm so sick of hearing what's good and what's not that I've just stopped listening. It's good one day and harmful the next. Like everyone else, can I say, I just don't care anymore. So there's really this quite worrying trend emerging here, where we can see that consumers are perceiving conflict when messages are changing from risk to benefit or vice versa, and it may be having quite negative knock-on effects. So we wanted to continue exploring this idea, and we looked at carrying out an experimental vignette study with over 800 European consumers. Margot already kind of talked about this idea of a vignette. It's a hypothetical scenario that you present to to the participants, and you try to see if different vignettes might elicit different responses. So what we wanted to look at was these 4 vignettes were presented. A quarter of the participants got the first vignette, which was an initial risk advisory from an official source. This was followed up by a second risk advisory from a trusted communicator. The second quarter of the participants, the 800 participants, again received the same initial risk advisory from an official source. This was followed up again by a second risk advisory from an untrusted communicator. And the thing actually I forgot to mention was this was all relating to consuming red meat, sorry. The third vignette then, the third quarter of consumers received the initial risk advisory from an official source, but this time this was followed up with a benefit advisory from a trusted communicator. And then again, the last quarter of the participants received the same initial risk advisory from an official source, and this was again followed up by benefit advisory from an untrusted communicator. So that might sound a little bit confusing, but I just want to say that on the top, the 2 top vignettes, basically they received 2 consistent risk advisories. The bottom 2 vignettes, the participants in those conditions, they received conflicting risk and benefit advisories on consuming red meat. So in the one instance, we were interested in finding out, would the participants who received conflicting messages, risk and benefit messages, would they judge the information as less credible? Would they judge the risk communicators as less credible? And the other thing we wanted to look at as well was whether the trustworthiness of the body communicating the conflicting message, whether that might moderate reactions to the information. So, for example, if you had an untrusted body communicating a new conflicting message, whether that might actually negate the negative effects of perceiving conflicting information. So what we found, very briefly, I just want to present, these are the statistically significant results that we got from the study. If you look at the finding in red there, what we found was that when consumers or when the participants received these conflicting risk and benefit messages, when they received a new benefit advisory, that actually rendered the initial risk advisory message from the official source as less credible. And that happened regardless of who communicated it. On the other hand, the new advisory that came out was not impacted by whether it conflicted or not with the initial advisory, and that just depended on the credibility of the person communicating it. So what that kind of tells us, what that implies, is that new information, and regardless of where it comes from, if it contradicts your official communication, it may actually render your message non-credible. So that's really important for people who are going out with official communications and feel that there are conflicting messages being communicated as well. From our qualitative research, we've seen that perceptions of a conflicting food and nutrition information environment potentially lead to negative knock-on consequences. And more research is needed to investigate this potential backlash effect to see if people actually are growing indifferent to nutrition messages and that's having a negative effect on their health behaviours. So I just want to sum up very quickly with some implications for communicators. This really stresses the importance of good relationships and dialogue with other stakeholders, the need to work to communicate balanced risk and benefit messages where it's needed, so to anticipate and acknowledge that consumers might infer conflict where there are risk and benefit properties relating to a food, and that to really emphasise to the consumer what they can do to make informed decisions based on it, and what they can do to alleviate any potential risks and to get the most out of the benefits in those situations. The media also have a really important role to play in terms of communicating balanced science messages, and I'm sure we'll find out more about science communication in the media in the next session. And finally then, the importance of monitoring. So just to be aware of what past communications have there been if you're going out with a new topic. So if you're going out with a risk message, has there previously been a benefit discourse? Is the discourse changing from risk to benefit or benefit to risk? And if it is, again, acknowledge and deal with that past communication and anticipate that the potential for consumers to infer uncertainty and the potential that they could become confused. Thank you.